In the deepest part of the prison, inside a pitch-black solitary cell, there was a strange man locked away. Day after day, he climbed the walls, not to escape, but to train his body. When the other inmates were out in the yard, he was lifting weights. When they rested, he practiced boxing. Even during labor, he deliberately took on the heaviest possible load and forced it onto his own shoulders. Whenever torrential rain poured down, he ran endurance drills through the mud. Round after round of high-intensity bodyweight training followed without pause. The reason he was so desperate to become stronger was actually very simple. It had nothing to do with hope, and even less to do with freedom. It was hatred. Pure, absolute hatred. Before going to prison, he had been nothing more than an ordinary steelworker with a beautiful wife and a quiet, peaceful life. But that fragile happiness was completely destroyed by a home invader who broke in on a whim purely to commit evil. Kyle was outside at the time, and through the phone, he clearly heard his wife's desperate screams for help. He drove home like a madman, but when he arrived, he saw his wife lying in a pool of blood, already lifeless. Her clothes were torn, her body covered in wounds. She had been brutally assaulted and abused to death. Later, Kyle risked everything to capture that monster and went through endless hardship to bring him to court. Naively, he believed that at least there would be justice there, but he never expected that the man was actually the heir of an incredibly wealthy family. The mountain of ironclad evidence against him was dismantled piece by clever lawyers and the magic of money. In the end, the man was declared not guilty and released. Seeing the smug and contemptuous smirk on the killer's face, Kyle's last shred of faith in the law, in order, and in human nature completely collapsed. However, just as the murderer was about to walk out of the courtroom, Kyle suddenly grabbed a guard's pistol and frantically pulled the trigger at his enemy. Several gunshots exploded through the solemn courtroom, and the man fell to the ground. His revenge had been achieved, but the real nightmare had only just begun. Kyle was sentenced to life in prison. He was immediately transferred to the infamous Kauai prison, a place that made every inmate tremble just hearing its name. Here, the law was the biggest joke. Human life was worth less than grass. If you wanted to survive in this place where the strong preyed on the weak, you either needed fists strong enough or pockets deep enough. And every rule here, life, death, honor, and humiliation, was decided solely by the prison warden, who could control everything with a single whim. The intake process ran like an assembly line. The prisoners' belongings were violently confiscated, and Kyle was no exception. But even that wasn't enough for the guards. Their eyes landed on the wedding ring on his left hand. That ring was the only thing he had left of his wife, and Kyle refused to hand it over. His resistance only brought him a more brutal beating from the guards, and in the end, the ring was still ripped off his finger. Kyle dared not speak out. All he could do was stare at the guard who took it. The surrounding prisoners stood silent as the grave. Not a single one dared to meet his eyes. That was the rule of Kauai. Once you stepped inside, you were worth less than livestock, let alone dignity. Inside the prison, power was divided among three major gangs, and conflicts were constant. Among the Russian mafia faction was a prisoner nicknamed Mad Dog, a sadistic psychopath who took pleasure in abusing the weak. Billy, who entered prison at the same time as Kyle, was only 21 years old and had a gentle, youthful face. On Billy's very first night in prison, Mad Dog came knocking. What followed was a long and public humiliation and torture. Billy's screams, so horrifying they barely sounded human, echoed through the cell block and lasted the entire night. The guards didn't stop it. In fact, they even thoughtfully shut the cell door because Mad Dog had already paid them off. The next day, Kyle saw Billy's miserable condition and the undisguised cruelty on Mad Dog's face. That expression looked exactly like the vile face of the man who had killed his wife. Kyle flew into a rage and beat Mad Dog, and their fight quickly drew the attention of the guards. But they only restrained Kyle, while giving Mad Dog a reassuring look. Their collusion was obvious. Afterward, Kyle was taken away alone and thrown directly into solitary confinement, a place known as the prison inside the prison. Sewage flowed across the floor, the stench unbearable. The walls were stained with dark red blood left behind by previous prisoners who had fought to the death. The food was a mush resembling pig slop. For sleep, there was only a cold stone slab next to a foul-smelling pipe. After several days of such inhuman torture, Kyle's mental defenses finally collapsed. He tore strips from the cloth they had given him, braided them into a rope, and tried to hang himself. But the rough fabric snapped, making even death an unattainable luxury. In despair, he suddenly rammed his head against the wall, and his consciousness blurred instantly. Once wasn't enough, then twice. He kept going until the flesh on his forehead was mangled and blood poured down his face. Through the haze of blood, a moth suddenly flew in from somewhere and began circling in front of him, lingering in the air. Then it gently landed on the bowl of cold, foul food. As if possessed, Kyle picked up the bowl. The moth flew again and landed on the spoon, almost like it was pointing the way. Perhaps his wife couldn't bear to see him sink into despair and had become this tiny creature to remind him. If she were still alive, she would never allow him to fall like this. So Kyle hesitated no longer and forced himself to swallow the tasteless food, one bite at a time. When he was finally released from solitary, the guards still had no intention of letting him go. He was taken to a notorious cell. When the door opened, 3 of the 4 beds were empty. The guards sneered and explained that the only other prisoner inside was a psychopathic killer who had already tortured and murdered his previous 3 cellmates. If Kyle didn't want to become the 4th, he would have to pay up. After saying that, the guards shoved him inside. When the door slammed shut, Kyle finally saw the man clearly, a huge, muscular giant with absolutely no humanity in his eyes. After surviving a terrifying night, Kyle gathered every bit of money he could find and begged the guard to transfer him to another cell. The guard mocked him, saying the money wasn't enough. Kyle had no choice but to swallow his anger. Later, he gradually learned that the prison openly ran a bloody fighting ring, a capital game where human lives were the stakes. This was the only path upward that was tolerated. The winners gained status and privileges. The losers were often beaten to death on the spot. The guards and the warden didn't just know about it. They were the creators of the system and the biggest bookmakers. They skimmed huge profits from bets and bribes, turning murder into the most lucrative business imaginable. Mad Dog was the undefeated champion of this bloody arena, and the warden's most profitable weapon. Crossing him was the same as challenging the entire prison's profit system. Before long, retaliation came. Mad Dog's men dragged Kyle away. Under the indifferent gaze of the guards, they beat him publicly. Afterward, Kyle was thrown back into solitary confinement. It was obvious. They didn't want him dead. They just wanted him to suffer a fate worse than death. The most terrifying torture came when it rained. Whenever a storm hit, rainwater would flood into the cell and mix with the sewage, instantly turning the room into a filthy pool of waste. There was nowhere to sleep, and the stench was overwhelming, pushing the suffering to the absolute extreme. No one knew how many days and nights passed. When Kyle finally came out again, his eyes were empty and his appearance was like a beggar's. He had endured all of this, but endless patience did not bring peace. It only made Mad Dog more arrogant. At lunchtime one day, Mad Dog walked up to Kyle's table in front of everyone. He spat into Kyle's food tray and ordered him to wait obediently in his cell that night. Kyle knew that if he took one step back now, he would lose far more than just dignity. But if he moved forward, it meant death. Yet his dignity would remain. Since he had already reached the end of the road, what was there left to fear in a fight? The guards rushed over. Without asking questions or investigating, they immediately charged Kyle with disturbing the order.
Going inside for a long, long time.
This time in solitary confinement made Kyle finally realize something. Hell had its own rules. The strong devoured the weak, and the winner took everything. If he wanted to preserve the last bit of humanity inside him, he would first have to master the most extreme form of violence. From that day on, he trained desperately. Without equipment, he used the prison itself. Walls, iron bars, the floor, sandbags, heavy objects, the yard, anything he could use to strengthen his body and his will. As his body grew stronger, his eyes became colder and harder. After months of brutal training, he stepped into the fighting ring. His opponent was none other than his sworn enemy, Mad Dog. The match began, and Kyle was instantly stunned by a heavy punch to the face. A brutal knee strike followed, forcing him immediately onto the defensive. Mad Dog launched a fierce assault. Kyle endured every blow until he finally spotted a tiny opening and knocked him down with a single iron punch. Then came the second punch, the third, an explosive counterattack. But Mad Dog's endurance was far greater, and his defense was nearly impenetrable. Dazed and battered, Kyle was no match. Mad Dog hoisted him up and slammed him to the ground with a powerful shoulder throw. Then he drove his knee into Kyle's temple, blurring his vision. Another vicious roundhouse kick followed. Finally, Mad Dog grabbed Kyle's leg and smashed it hard against the cage bars. At the moment between life and death, Kyle kicked Mad Dog violently in the groin. Then he lunged forward and bit through Mad Dog's carotid artery with his teeth. By the time everyone reacted and pulled him away, Mad Dog's throat had already been torn open. Life had left him. The entire yard fell into dead silence. Only Kyle, drenched in blood, let out a beast-like roar. Prisoners, guards, and even the warden were deeply shocked by the brutal scene. After that battle, Kyle became the new king of the prison fights. His tactics contained no technique, only pure will, trading injury for life. Every blow from his opponents he endured with his body, then repaid them with double, triple, even 10 times the ferocity until they collapsed. Under the rule that losers died, he climbed climbed step by step up a blood-soaked staircase made of corpses. Now he wore his hair slicked straight back, his eyes cold and commanding. He had become the undisputed godfather of the prison. The Dragon Slayer had become the dragon. The man who resisted violence had become a tyrant. Compared to Kyle's descent into violence, Billy's resistance had always been driven by a single idea: escape. He tried to escape again and again, and was caught every time. Each failure brought even harsher punishment. But some steel only grows harder the more it's hammered. At last, hope was within reach. Using a stolen key, Billy successfully opened his cell door. Just as he went to retrieve the iron tool he had hidden earlier, he was caught by the guards. This time, Billy's fate was extremely brutal. The guards handed him over to a vicious giant. When Kyle finally saw him again, Billy had been tortured to the point where he had only one breath left. In his final moments, he told Kyle something.
Don't let them turn you into something you're not.
After saying it, Billy breathed his last breath. His soul had never surrendered, nor had it been corrupted. Kyle finally awakened. He understood the true nature of violence. It could never bring real victory. It would only turn you into the very thing you once hated. Another fight soon arrived. His opponent was the giant who had tortured Billy to death. Facing his enemy, Kyle chose to do nothing. He refused to fight back, no matter how badly he was beaten. The warden's fury was unimaginable. He had lost face in front of his wealthy patrons, and all the bets had collapsed. In rage, he had Kyle hung from an iron frame in the center of the yard. He would only be taken down when he agreed to fight again. Otherwise, the frame would become his gallows. But this punishment became a boomerang that struck the oppressor himself. Day after day, under scorching sun and pouring rain, Kyle, denied food and water, became weaker and weaker. Yet no matter how much he suffered, he never gave in. At first, the prisoners mocked him, but gradually, they saw a completely different kind of strength in him. They began to reflect. Why were they killing each other just to entertain the warden? Why had they turned from victims of violence into consumers and accomplices of violence? Was it fear, profit, or numbness? Like wildfire, this awakening spread through the prison. The gangs stopped their pointless fights. The arena had no more contestants. The prisoners' silent, non-violent resistance made every system built on fear lose its power. The warden's bloody business completely collapsed. Without throwing a single punch, Kyle had allowed peace to defeat violence in the most unexpected way. But there was an even more ironic twist. The warden couldn't simply kill Kyle.
If we kill him, we turn him into a martyr.
Of course, he wouldn't allow Kyle to become a symbol of faith among the prisoners. So one day, he released Kyle, only to stage a public execution. Naturally, clever rulers never dirty their own hands. He unleashed his strongest fighting dog, a monstrous giant nearly 8 feet tall, whose humanity had been destroyed by drugs and torture. When the collar was removed, the giant charged at Kyle, beating him until his bones cracked and his tendons tore. This was exactly what the warden wanted. He wanted everyone to see that any form of resistance, violent or non-violent, would ultimately be crushed by even greater violence. The power of life and death had to be held with absolute brutality. At the very moment between life and death, Kyle instinctively slapped the iron gate. When the giant heard the sound, he suddenly stopped. Every time Kyle had been in solitary confinement, someone in the next cell would tap on the wall. Kyle would always tap back twice. They had never spoken, never seen each other's faces, but through those taps, they had become companions who supported each other in spirit. Kyle never imagined that this mysterious neighbor was the giant standing before him. The giant's mind was damaged, but it was enough for him to recognize the tapping sound. He reached out and gently brushed Kyle's face with his thick fingers. The warden was stunned. Seeing his display of intimidation turning into a joke, he immediately ordered his men to execute Billy. To protect Kyle, the giant charged at the guards despite the bullets. With nothing but brute strength, he knocked them down one after another. He even smashed down a heavy iron gate before collapsing in a pool of blood. His tragic death ignited the prisoners' rage completely. They rushed out of their cells and began beating the guards. The entire prison instantly erupted into chaos. Some prisoners destroyed property, some started fires, others tried to escape in the confusion. Only after the warden deployed armed forces and suppressed the riot with gunfire was the uprising finally crushed. During the chaos, Kyle did not join either side. Instead, he chose to rescue his murderous cellmate. It turned out the man was not the bloodthirsty killer everyone believed him to be. He was actually an underground cleaner. The people he hunted were the worst scum, criminals who had exploited legal loopholes and continued committing atrocities inside the prison. The cellmate then revealed his real trump card, a diary. Inside it were detailed records of how the warden had turned the prison into a private execution ground and a black money empire. Every life taken and every dollar earned was written clearly. He handed the life and death notebook to Kyle and asked him to take it outside and expose the truth. As for escaping, the cellmate had already planned everything. He told Kyle to fight one more match, regardless of the outcome. To restore his shaken authority after the riot, the warden would certainly have Kyle executed. executed, and the road from the arena to the execution ground would be the perfect opportunity to escape. Soon, Kyle faced his final opponent, the giant who had tortured Billy. After several rounds, Kyle killed him in the same brutal way he had used on others, impaling him on a wooden stake. Billy's blood debt was finally repaid. Just as the cellmate predicted, Kyle was immediately escorted to the execution ground. As soon as they entered the garage, the cellmate suddenly burst out from a hidden passage. Working together, they quickly subdued the guards. Kyle finally recovered his wedding ring. The cellmate handed him a uniform and car keys, but he chose to stay behind because he still had a mission he needed to complete personally. Soon, Kyle drove through one checkpoint after another. Seeing the warden's car, the guards all stood at attention and saluted. No one dared to inspect it. Just like that, pretending to be the warden, driving the warden's car, and carrying the evidence that would destroy the warden, Kyle drove toward dawn and freedom. At the same time, the warden received his final reckoning in his office. When the guards broke down the door, they found him covered in blood, all his teeth knocked out. The warden had met his end in the most brutal way imaginable.